I was born in Ohio, Youngstown, Ohio. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. I am the proud son of a single mother. We grew up on the other side of the tracks. And my mother was a social worker, and she raised me and my two brothers along with my grandparents. And at any one point in time, we had half a dozen foster children in our home. And we grew up across the street from the Howard paper mills. And the Howard paper mills sometimes used to send out fumes that were so strong the only way that we could breathe was to open the refrigerator door. And we had very little. We had no money. My mother made a lot of sacrifice, and education was my ticket out. In the 6th grade, there was a teacher who recognized that I had some talents and asked my mother if it was okay for me to go to school, and I walked 3/4 of a mile to a mile to go to school in the suburbs. And from there, I was able to get a good education, and in 11th grade, a teacher challenged me. She said, if you're as good as they say you are, go test yourself against the big boys and girls in the East. And at 16, I took a Greyhound bus around New England looking for schools, and that continued my journey in education, which eventually led me to New York City.
Well, you picked up quite a few degrees on your way. You were an undergraduate at Harvard, and then you went to Harvard Business School and Law School?
I did indeed, yes. I was fortunate, which is why I say education was my ticket out.
Mm-hmm. So you were recruited to your first job, right, at First Boston, and that's how you got in. And then from there, the people who recruited you to First Boston formed their own firm, recruited you there, and then you were recruited again to Merrill Lynch and Morgan Stanley and then Citigroup. I mean, it's like a who's who of the top financial world, but it seems like everyone wanted you. Have you ever actually had to apply for a job, Ray?
Well, you know, my first job application was my first interview for a job on Wall Street. And I remember there was scheduled to be a cocktail party. That's what they told us. And when I got to the room, the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Boston, the room emptied. There was one person there who began to interview me, and he said, listen, you got 5 minutes, shoot your best shot. And I said, what do you want me to say? He says, you got 4 minutes and 45 seconds. And so I'm from the neighborhood, right? You don't let anybody get up in your grill like that. Mm-hmm. And so my response was a response that eventually led me to one of 2 summer associate jobs at First Boston.
What was your pitch? Like, this is a world that you really had no part of, no connection to until then.
I had no connection, and my response to the interviewer, who had, once the room had emptied, turned his chair back to me and straddled his chair and said, okay, you got 4 minutes and 45 seconds. Shoot your best shot. I said Harvard College, Harvard Law School, and Harvard Business School pride themselves on taking the cream of the crop. I pride myself on being the film off the top of the cream. He said.
Well, that was a pretty good answer, I guess. But let me ask you, like, I mean, you're an outlier, really. Can you expect other people to succeed in the way that you did?
The answer is we should have those expectations. I shouldn't be an outlier. And I have spent the large part of my career making certain that even though I was a soul brother, S-O-U-L, I wasn't the soul brother, S-O-L-E. And so part of the pride that I take on 36 years of having been in this business is to have extended the ladder so that those others who had the skill set, who had the education, could have the opportunity to get into the room the way that I'd been in the room. So when you get in the room, where it happens, you got to make certain that you extend the ladder. And so I'm really proud that I've been able to extend the ladder to so many and have so many mentees out there who've done so extraordinarily well.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you worked in an extremely white world for most of, 36 years, I think, in high finance. What was that like?
Well, what you recognize is, in many instances, I was the only person who every day woke up black. And you have to be able to compete. So there are 4 pillars on which I stand, and that is prayer, because this has been a walk of faith; preparation, I know what it's like not to be prepared; performance, and when you're in the neighborhood, you got to be a little paranoid. And so I've had to perform every single opportunity I've gotten in that education, in that training, and how you grow up gives you instincts and skills to survive. And I've been able to do that, but that's primarily through performance. So look at the track record. And the track record in each instance showed that I performed.
And you succeeded at all these steps, and you were in a very comfortable position. You knew your business, you knew your industry, you were on the top of the world, and you left it all behind to run for mayor along with a lot of other people, something you've never done. You know, the chances of failure are actually pretty high for any candidate who runs. What inspired you to make such a leap?
You know, I love this city. I love this city. This city is where I met my wife, where we're raising our family. And so if I can take my lived experiences, and if I can take the leadership, proven leadership skills that I've evidenced every step of the way, and the relationships that I've been able to develop, I can pull the city together. And I can lead the city to the greatest comeback, economic comeback, inclusive economic comeback in the history of New York City. So yes, while it may be a new venture, when I landed on Wall Street, it was a new venture. There's so many others who've come into this public service arena who haven't been in the arena, and I've crossed all sections. I've gone from the streets to the suites. And the ability to be able to do that and bringing this city together with all three, there's very few, if any, who have the combination of lived experience, proven leadership, and relationships. And the other thing, Eric, is I don't want anybody anything. I'm like the great Shirley Chisholm. I'm unbought, unbossed, and unbound. Bupkis. So my sole focus is going to be what's in the best interest of New York City.
Well, you are not self-funding your campaign. You are taking campaign donations, and as it happens, we live in a world where suddenly not taking money from the real estate industry has become a thing. It is like a calling card for some candidates. But I assume that you are taking money from the finance industry, real estate industry, anyone else. So what do you say to those folks who say, well, you know, he's part of the industry establishment?
So I am prepared to take money from anybody whose interests are aligned with mine, which is in the best interest of New York City. So I'll take money from the artist. I'll take money from the actors. I'll take money from whomever is prepared to support me in this journey to lead New York City. And the divisive language is done with. We saw yesterday in stark relief the result of divisive language. We need to come together. We saw that. We saw that. We saw a nation divided. And unless we're prepared to deal with this, we're going to have nightmares of a city divided. I can bring the city together. So yes, I am prepared to take support from all those who are prepared to give it. And let me tell you something, $5,100 ain't going to change me.
But what about the folks who say, well, you know, he's a wealthy banker, lives on Central Park West. Like, what real connection does he have to New Yorkers? Like, what is your shared experience with the average New Yorker? My
shared experience with the average is how I grew up. I never left home. Somebody's got the shared experiences. I live this every single day. I know what it's like not to have. I know what it's like to have those little small kernels of the end of soap, and you put them together to convince yourself you got a bar of soap. I know what it's like to wash tin foil, to convince yourself you got a clean sheet of tin foil. I know what it's like when my mother debated whether or not she paid Dayton Power and Light, or put food on the table, or put tithes in the church. I know what that's like. So anybody who dares question that never walked in my shoes.
So in your campaign video, you said, this time we'll make sure that it's a city that works for everyone. So in what ways is the city not working for everyone now?
You know, one of the things I exposed here, the combination of George Floyd and COVID has unveiled what many of us live, 400 years of systemic inequities. This has not been inclusive growth. We have divides in economics. We have divides in healthcare. We have divides in education. We have divides in the carceral system. So if I look across every sector and look at the divides, they're only growing starker. They're only growing starker. So the growth that we've experienced has not been inclusive growth. Too many people have been left behind. The divide that we now experience, the racial divide, the religious divide, the economic divide, the healthcare delivery system divide, those divides have existed. It just took 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a cold-blooded murder for us to say, we've got to do something about it. And COVID is ripped through each of our neighborhoods, disproportionate in Black and brown communities. So yeah, there's the divide. That divide and the starkness of that divide has just now been revealed, but many of us have lived that every single day.
there seems to be quite a few people who would agree with you, but don't want to tweak the system or reform the system. They actually want to throw it out. They don't feel that capitalism is serving their interest as working class New Yorkers, or working class Americans for that matter. But you have been a capitalist for your whole career. It's served you very well. What do you say to those folks who say the system can't work for us and we just need to throw it out?
I look at the profile of people who are saying that. Black and brown people want opportunity. They want capital in their neighborhood so these businesses can form. If you look at the track record and look at the investments that we have made, that I personally made, in making certain that these people get access, that we get access to capital, so that we can form, that we can go from lower class to middle class to the wealthy class. Black and brown people want the same dreams. All of a sudden we get here, and all of a sudden we're going to change the rules of engagement. No, I want to make certain that we're included in this growth. My vision is for inclusive growth, and yes, that includes capitalism. Yes, because I want our people to get to the same aspirations, that have the same dreams. And I've written a foreword about the impact of systemic racism on black and brown people. That impact, the cost to the system, $16 trillion. And if we deal with it today, we got $5 trillion that get contributed to the U.S. economy, if we deal with that.
Now, how as mayor would you change the system in such a way that the benefits of this immense wealth creation that we have in New York City actually goes to more people?
So one of the things that we haven't had in a long time are public-private partnerships. We need to bring the private sector in. So the private sector coordinates with the public sector. And so we all recognize that our interests are aligned. We did this in the 70s. Business and labor and government came together. We did this at 9/11. Business, labor, government all came together. We have examples of where this has occurred. We have examples. So if you take those examples and you take where we are now, which is in a much more desperate state of crisis, we will all need to come together. And so what I will do is, based on my relationships, based on my proven leadership experience, and based on my lived experience, be able to bring the bricks of the boardroom together. Because that's my life, being fluent in both.
You know, New York City for decades really was a product of the financial crisis of the 1970s, when we realized people were leaving the city, crime was rising, the future of the city was in doubt, and there was a focus on creating jobs and bringing investment back. And then a funny thing happened, like we actually did so well. We created nearly 1 million jobs, and a lot of people made money, but we didn't actually build housing for the average New Yorkers. And so the people who are getting these high-paying jobs were sort of filtering out, gentrifying neighborhoods, moving into housing, and other people could not afford the prices. So a strange dynamic occurred where suddenly jobs were bad. You know, jobs were going to bring people who would outbid us for housing and push us out. And Amazon went down, and the industry city rezoning went down. And so you have a different dynamic now. I'm wondering, what would your message be to folks who say, you know, we don't want high-paying jobs in our neighborhood because they're going to change the character of our neighborhood and they're going to raise our rents?
So again, you need to look at the demographics of the people who are yelling the loudest. Amazon City, HQ2, and Industry City would not have happened on my watch. Meaning that failure, that gross ineptitude would not have happened. And part of the reason that there was a failure is because they didn't include the community from the start. The real people in the community, the culturally rich community that stood the test or stood the risk of being displaced. So in each instance, you can't come top down. You have to make certain that you include all the constituents, especially the ones who are most at risk. So on my watch, they would have been at the table. The neighborhood people would have been at the table early in the planning process. I have friends who live where HQT was going to be, who have unfettered views of the East River, who say, I want it there. I want the jobs. I want the schools. I want what's going to be built in infrastructure because it's going to benefit the black and brown members of the community. So yes, and if you do a poll now, the people in the community, they want those kinds of institutions there.
It seems that constituency is still there. You're right, the polling did support Amazon, but they're not the loudest voices. Like, the loudest voices seem to be the folks who are afraid of these big projects. and they become convinced that real estate development is bad for them, that it will push them out, it will raise prices. You know, I'm sure you know a little bit about economics, having been in banking all these years. How do you explain to folks that no, like these projects will actually help?
They will actually help if they are designed right from the outset, and they include the people who are most at risk and most threatened from the outset. That's how these projects are successful. And given what I've been able to accomplish in my 36 years of business, leadership in business, understanding all constituents, managing budgets. I manage over 50 budgets and doing transactions that have gone $600 to $700 billion worth of transactions, knowing how to get the right people in the room. I would have gotten the right people in the room. And where we have agreements, we can agree to disagree, but there'd be respect, and those people would be in the room. Because those are the lives that have been most deeply impacted. Those are the ones that don't have the income in those neighborhoods. There's $20-some-odd billion worth of revenue that we now are without.
Well, one of the reasons people, many New Yorkers, have a negative impression of the real estate industry is because there's a lot of attention paid to these projects, these high-priced condos, where folks are building 4,000 square foot condos and they're selling them for $10 million, $30 million, $50 million, $238 million in the case of one penthouse. I mean, that's not housing for average New Yorkers. So I'm wondering, what would your housing plan be to actually build units or create them so that regular working class and middle class folks can live there?
So we needed, and part of my economic vision is go big, go small. Go big, develop affordable housing, fix the fractured infrastructure, bridges and sewage mains and water mains, and build the city of the future. Technological infrastructure. So it has to be truly affordable housing. And what we're built now is not that.
But do you think there's been a market failure? Because obviously developers, some of them, not all, have decided that they can make a lot more money by building large apartments for the 1%. How do you tell them, like, even though that's in your financial best interest, to do something else? So
let's go through the numbers. There was a period in New York where we built 2.2 housing units per new job. Today we build 0.5 housing units per new job. The demand has so outpaced the supply that the prices have gone up. We need to step back and review that and change that so that we create truly affordable housing, workforce housing, where people shouldn't have to pay 50 to 60 to 70% of their income to afford rent. And so we have to address this in such a way that everybody's got to give. The developers need to recognize that the returns they've generated historically are not going to be the returns if they want to invest in this city. If this city's going to work, we all have to contribute, including the developers.
Now, Mayor de Blasio's housing policy was essentially, we'll upzone, and if you build in these upzone neighborhoods, you'll have to set aside 25–30% of your units as affordable. Do you agree with that policy? There's been a lot of complaints that it has not worked, that it hasn't produced enough units, and in fact, a lot of rezonings are now being rejected, so the policy can't even be implemented.
So we need to review the policy, for one, because it hasn't worked, given what I've told you about 0.5 units per new job, and the jobs have increased. We need to be more creative. For example, we have underbuilt housing and overbuilt hotels. There are examples out there in large cities where we've converted hotels to housing, affordable housing. We should be able to do that here. Overbuilt hotels, underbuilt housing. Let's convert the hotels.
Now, you're coming from the business side of things. Usually business doesn't like a lot of regulation. As mayor, you would kind of be telling business or steering business in a certain direction. So how do you draw that line in terms of the amount of influence that government has over what private interests want to do?
Well, I wouldn't. First of all, we're overly regulated. We have too much red tape. We have too many permits. This is the most expensive large city in the country in which to build. And so I wouldn't call it regulation, I would call it partnership. And I would say, let's invite the key decision makers into the room and let's have discussion. And I know how to get this done. We know who the players are, we know who the people are in the community, let's get them in a room, which has never happened, by the way. We've been a bit patronizing in our approach to this. It never happened, by the way. Let's get them in the room and have discussion.
So the boogeyman in New York City real estate development these days is gentrification. You can't really build any project without being accused of furthering gentrification, and that seems to just kill, from the outset, any momentum that projects might have. And how do you overcome that? I'm sure you're aware of the gentrification that has occurred in many neighborhoods, black and mixed neighborhoods across the city. Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy, used to be almost entirely black, and now there's quite a bit of diversity there, but it has led to backlash.
Gentrification is real. It is real. Communities are being displaced. The whole complexion of these communities are changing, which is why I say in order for these large projects to work, in order for us to have a sustainable development model, you have to get the communities in place. They have to be at the table because they're being displaced. So whether it's a perception or reality, it's both. And perception is reality in many of our communities, and so we have to address that. And I would do just that, aggressively address it. Remember, I'm unbeholden. So my slate is clean. In order for this city to survive, we have to have truly affordable housing. And we have to take people from low-income housing to middle-income housing. We have to provide that. It should not be that a citizen in New York pays 60 to 70% of their income in rent. We have to change that.
So the late David Dinkins used to talk about the gorgeous mosaic. Mm-hmm. But New York City is actually one of the most segregated cities in the world, not just the neighborhoods, but the school system. So, and there are others, it's not alone in that. There are other cities that are also segregated by neighborhood. So as someone who grew up in Dayton, Ohio, on what you call the other side of the tracks, mm-hmm. Do you consider segregation to be a problem in New York, and what could be done about it? So
let's take a look at that. The way we broke through in segregation is 1954 in Brown versus Board. You should also know that in 1954, we started with government approval, Levittown. And there we had redlining, which through government-sponsored home ownership, it excluded black folks. And what Charlie Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall decided to do was to launch the attack on segregated schools as opposed to segregated neighborhoods. Today, we need to approach both. Because the school system's segregated, and we don't have quality education in each of these neighborhoods, which is what we need to have, quality education. I got through because of quality education. And my plan is cradle to career. Pre-K is good, but I want to start before pre-K. Because what we know is by the time many of these kids get to pre-K, they're already behind. And what we also know is that as these children as they're developing and learning, so 0 to 4, pre-K, pre-K. And I want to make sure that by the end of the 3rd grade, every child in New York, and I want to be held accountable for this, every child in New York can read. Because from 0 to the end of the 3rd grade, our children are learning to read. After that, they're reading to learn. So if they never learn to read, we know the pipeline. We know the pipeline, and then I want to expose them in grade 6 to different opportunities, whether they become paleontologists or coders or programmers, or those who want to work with their hands become engineers and mechanics. I want to make sure we give them the opportunity so by the time they graduate, that they have the opportunity to either go get a job, and I want the private sector to be a partner here, or they go to a 2 or 4 year college. That's the vision that I have. That will address the segregation that exists in so many different facets of this great city.
Now, you were bused to a different school, right? You famously traveled, what, an hour and a half to get to school?
I walked about a 3/4 of a mile to a mile and got bused to the suburbs, school in the suburbs, so that I could make certain, so my mother could make certain. That was all on scholarship. I was on scholarship from 6th grade until the time I finished graduate school. So I know what it's like not to have, but I also know what it's like to have a great education. So part of the rationale here is for each of our children to have a quality education.
But would you prescribe that kind of model where we'll take kids whose local school might not be doing that well and have them pick
I
up
will
us?
prescribe every model that gets our kids quality education so that they're not an outsider, so that they just come standard course. And you know what you also got to address? You got to address access to technology, because today we're not doing that. And maybe if you had that, you could bridge some of this divide, but we've now created a COVID generation where that divide is only widened.
You know, one of the things that COVID has brought is momentum to the cancel rent movement, because unemployment has been rampant. A lot of people lost their jobs. They don't have money for rent. So the movement has popped up, let's cancel rent. And I wondered what you thought of that. Like, that is not something that came up in economics classes. The idea of just people not paying rent at all. What do you think of the cancel rent movement?
You know, it maybe didn't come up in economics classes because we never envisioned really the reality of an environment and situation like we have today. You have to look at the entire equation. You have to look at it from the tenant standpoint, you have to look at it from the landlord standpoint. And so yes, I think we ought to give tenants relief today. We need to give tenants relief today. But you also need to give landlords some relief, because landlords have bills to pay as well. And so you have to look at the entirety of the equation. And the tenants, we have to give shelter. We have a legal obligation and a moral right to give people shelter. So I would make certain that that equation worked. I'd give relief over on the one hand, I'd give relief on the other hand, just to make it work. But first and foremost, you got to keep people in their homes.
But the notion that landlords are wealthy and should just be able to suck it up and provide during this period, they're saying we're struggling too. I mean, where do you?
Because we are struggling. The entire ecosystem is struggling. The pandemic has identified the struggles. It has worsened the struggles for so many.
You know, one of the things when we have this debate with politicians, like, they'll say, okay, we'll give landlords relief, but you have to be a small landlord.
Well, small landlords are the ones that are hurting. Small businesses are part of my overall economic vision. We gotta work with the small businesses. That's 45 to 50% of the employee base in New York. So small businesses, giving small business relief, making small businesses, making them clients and customers of the city, having a small business advocate, including for the small landlords, we need to work that out.
But if you owned a large portfolio but had borrowed a lot of money to acquire it, and maybe 25% of your tenants aren't paying rent all of a sudden, maybe you can't make your mortgage payments, you know, you might not be small, but you could lose your assets, right?
You could lose your assets. So if you're a large landlord and you can't meet your debt service and you go insolvent, what do you think happens to that real estate? It just exists. Who pays for it? So I have no rent. Tenants are not paying rent. Landlords can't pay their bill. The business it becomes bankrupt. What happens? There's no heat because nobody's paying any bills. There's no electricity. Nobody's paying electricity. You have to look at the entirety of it. You have to look at the entire equation in order for, and somebody's going to have to give, everybody's going to have to contribute a lot in order to make this work. I get the reality of both sides. I know what it's like. So it is not something, it's not an equation that is a foreign equation to me. We have to balance it.
So government is a little short on cash these days. That has revived talk of a pied-à-terre tax, a tax on second homes, and that's also revived talk of a billionaire's tax. So we already have a millionaire's tax in New York, but now we're talking about a billionaire's tax. So I wonder what your thoughts are on taxing second homes that are worth $5 million or more.
So let me, if you permit me, let me address that in the totality of the equation. We cannot tax our way out of this. We must grow our way out of this. And those who have the resources, like me, are going to have to pay a little bit more. A draconian tax system where in income tax is only 14% of the overall equation. So a system that encourages U-Haul and the movers to come to the city so that those people decide to leave the city, and we see this in other geographies, is not a system that's going to help this city. So we need to strike the right balance. And when it comes to the budget, of which I've managed a lot, You need to look at the budget in total, not just one line item. Not just one line item. And so you have to step back, look at the entirety of it, look at how you're going to generate revenue. Taxes are going to be one aspect of the line of it, but you got to look at the entirety of the budget. You got to grow your way out of this. You can't tax your way out of this.
There's a debate about whether billionaires will leave the city if they are taxed too much. I presume you've hung out with some of these ultra wealthy folks, you know, cocktail parties, work functions. You probably know how they think a lot better than the average New Yorker or reporter for that matter. Like, what is your sense of, you know, how closely tied they are to the city, or whether they will move to a zero income tax state like Florida, you know, if there's no reason, if they don't see that the city is loving them?
So the New Yorkers with whom I interact across the spectrum love the city. They want to be in New York. So we need to make certain that New York experience is a vibrant experience. And those people who have the resources, who have multiple homes, like the people who have no resources or limited resources in one home, they're afraid. They're afraid of COVID. They're afraid of losing their jobs. They're afraid of what may happen with all the segregation that's occurring. They're afraid of police interaction. They're afraid of those things, but people want to live here. They want to be here. And if we discourage people from being here, those who have options will leave, and the burden's then going to be left on the people who have limited resources to pay. That's the way the equation's going to work. And the vast majority of New Yorkers don't have second homes. This is their home. This is their livelihood. This is where their wealth is, tied primarily up into their home. So I want to make certain that I protect the value of those middle-income homes. I want to make certain that we give homes to those people who are less well-resourced. And I want to make certain that we retain those people who are the highest taxpayers. I want to do it all, because in order for this city to survive and have a future that is at minimum as great as its past, we need everybody to come together.
One of the issues of home ownership is property taxes. It's not an issue that people pay a lot of attention to unless you are faced with a property tax bill that you can't afford. But I just wondered if you're aware of this fight about, you know, how proportional property taxes are to the value of your home, because there is a discrepancy where some people are paying a much higher percentage of their home's value in property taxes than others. Are you familiar with that issue at all, and what do you think could be done?
I am familiar with the issue, and I understand that the tax code needs to be restructured, because today it's imbalanced and unfair. It needs to be restructured.
And some folks would probably end up paying, I mean, as it happens, single-family homeowners in gentrified neighborhoods pay a lot less tax relative to the value of their home than they would in most minority neighborhoods, actually. So some folks, I would assume, would have to pay more if we were to make the system fair. Is that correct? So
I'm prepared to make the system fair. It's all about fairness and equity and proportionality. That's what it's about. The system has to be fair. Today it's inequitable. So I want to be clear. I do whatever I could to make the system equitable and fair.
So do you have relationships with real estate executives in New York? I don't know how much real estate work you did in your Citigroup career or other banking jobs, but do you know the movers and shakers of real estate?
I knew the movers and shakers on West 4th Street. I know the movers and shakers in Riverside Park. I know the movers and shakers, you tell me. I know the movers and shakers, man, from the streets to the suites. You have to have that range. So I know a lot of people. I got a long-standing relationships across the whole spectrum of this city. So I know a lot of people. I've been fortunate to know a lot of people and traffic in a lot of different neighborhoods.
So you once said, once I take off my suit and I put on a sweatsuit, I could easily be George Floyd. You mentioned George Floyd earlier. Have you ever had any negative experiences with police?
I think it is the disturbing thing about this, the reality is that the very few black people, especially black men, who haven't had an experience with the police. I would say 3 weeks or so ago, I get in a car and we go 2 blocks. There's a black driver and there's me, and there's a police siren pull over the driver. Roll down the window, you got 2 black guys in the car. What are you guys doing?
What were you doing?
We're going to a meeting. Sitting in a car going to a meeting.
How do you handle situations like that?
You know, you just got to manage through it. I mean, it's just, you know, you're 6'4", 200-pound black man. Your hands go up. You respond when the questions get asked. You show no hostility. You show no movement of hands. You look directly in the eye, and no false moves. The result of which is we have no idea. The stories are out there. That's our reality. That's my reality.
Some people have responded to that reality by saying we should defund the police. They don't believe the police can be reformed. What is your position?
Well, listen, I think we need to change the culture of the police. I do not support the language of defund. There are very few black people who will. I want better policing. I want better policing. And I want the police to have a culture of what I call RAP. I want them to be respectful, accountable, and proportionate. It has been said by others, the only thing that you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And in the black neighborhoods, sometimes it's a sledgehammer. And so we need to reform, and we need to invest in what are the 10 calls that go to the police have to do with mental health issues. We need to invest in the mental health professionals. We need to invest in the community organizations. We need to invest in the violence interrupters. And we need to return to community policing. Under Dave Dinkins, Safe Cities, Safe Streets, community policing. Know the people are policing so that that relationship of trust can be restored. Because right now it's been breached, it's divided. And part of that is to making certain that the people who are accountable, the bad actors, don't create a cloud over the entire force. And so we need to visibly hold those people accountable so that people recognize that you can't get away with a flagrant foul that gets caught on camera and then there's some debate. We can't, I got zero tolerance for that. Zero tolerance.
Now, you're a bit of a basketball player, am I right?
Just a little bit, yeah, I got a little game.
I've heard that you go down to playgrounds of New York City, you know, where the basketball level is quite high, you know, highly competitive games. You show up, no one knows you're a banker. What's that experience like?
Just like any other ball player, man. You got no game, you got no game, you're not picked up. Right? You can't wear Stan Smith sneakers to the court unless you got some real game. Right? You just don't play. So nobody knows what anybody else does on the court. They know whether or not you got game. So I don't really care about crossing somebody up or stepping back, drilling a three, or taking them down low in the paint. I don't really care about that, man. That's the way the game is played. So yeah, they don't care what you do. They don't care what your mama, your papa, your daddy did. Don't really care. You got game, you get down. But next, you don't. You sit on the sidelines.
So you mentioned you met your wife and raised your kids here in New York. Tell us a little bit about your family.
My wife is extraordinary. She's extraordinary. She was a lawyer. She is a film producer. She is a documentary producer. She's written 3 books. She's made a few films. So that's my wife. We have an 8-year-old who, you know, he's got a lot of game. We have an 18-year-old. He's in 2nd grade. We have an 18-year-old who is now taking a gap year. She did extraordinarily well in school. She plays ball also, and she wanted to take a year off, so another education year. She just finished her application to college. And then that's our 18-year-old, Ella. She's great. And then we have a 20-year-old who was in the first round draftee in the NBA for the Orlando Magic. And so, you know, he's got some game too.
What's his name?
His name is Cole Anthony. Cole Anthony is he's our one of 3, and my wife's mother is Cole Anthony, and Ella and Cole, and we've been together for a lot of years now. We're so proud of him. Mm-hmm. So I'm proud of all of our children, and so proud of my wife. So I'm blessed, fortunate with an extraordinary family.
You know, he's known as the son of Greg Anthony, who played for the Knicks. And so Greg Anthony could walk down the street and people would know who he was, but people don't know who you are yet, do they? How are you going to introduce yourself to the people of New York?
I'm Ray McGuire, and I'm running for mayor. That's how I introduce myself. when the word gets out, when people understand who I am and the life I've lived and what I've been able to accomplish and the support that I've given, the ladder. See, it's all about the ladder. When you get in a position, you got to hand down that ladder. And I look at the mentees and the people who have been, whom I'm so proud in this industry. I look at Ryan Williams at Cadre. I look at Robert Greffing at Compass. I look at those people, and I was there at the start. And I have so much pride in all they've been able to accomplish. So I'd say, as I say, look at the lily work, look at the mentees out there. And if there's a legacy, I'm looking at that legacy as my family first. And then it's the mentees and friends whose lives I've been able to have just a small part. And they've done so well, and I'm so extraordinarily proud.
I wonder if you're still in touch with any of the foster brothers and sisters that you grew up with and how they turned out generally.
Sure. We stay in contact. Some of us stay in contact. It is. When you live a life like that, you know reality, right? You know the harsh realities of life, and you also know the glories of life, and so you got to stay close to all of that. So when people ask how to identify, because that's who I am, that's my family, that's how I grew up.
Let me ask you one other thing. It's like, how many jobs do you think people get through networking, and how many jobs do you think people get through regular, filling out an application, sending it in? I would imagine in your industry there's quite a bit of networking, but most people don't have that kind of social capital to do that. So
people call me up, and one of the things I committed to early on was to respond to every email and every voicemail, because I recognize how difficult it is to enter. Most of us, I didn't have a legacy. When I started out and wanted to have lunch with somebody who looked like me, it was me alone. There was one other person whom I knew who worked at a different firm who introduced me to this banking business. I didn't know anything about it. So having relationships is important, but having relationships in everything we do is important. But many of these children, they looked to a cover of Black Enterprise magazine and saw me and a friend of mine on that cover, and they say that it so influenced them. You know why? Because it showed them it was possible. It's possible for somebody who looked like them to go and participate in an industry like this where a lot of big decisions were made. And they too, if they had the opportunity, could come and they could compete. And they could demonstrate that they had the skills to succeed, which is what I've been able to do and what I've been able to allow other people to do. And I'm so proud of that. So proud of that. Often it's just the images that give us the hope, that tell us that it's possible. And I've been fortunate to be in the position where I can do that as a Black man, as a proud Black man. And it goes across, it's Black men, it's Black women, it's white men, it's white women, it's Black and brown. And people see me there and they know that I care because I have a history of caring and a history of mentoring. And they say, I too can be possible, this is possible for me. You know what, they call me up. They call me up and years later they say, you don't remember me, but you returned my phone call and I talked to you, you gave me a little time. And that guided my path. And seeing you there, especially for as long as you've been there, and we recognize, Mr. McGuire, that you've been there longer than anybody in the history of Wall Street. You know what it said to me, that maybe I can do this too.